The sunrise painted the city sky in shades of orange and pink as Dr. Samantha Carter stood in front of her bedroom mirror. She adjusted her simple white t-shirt and checked her worn blue jeans one last time. Today was different. Instead of her usual formal police chief uniform, she had chosen to dress like any other person on the street. Her natural hair was tied back in a neat ponytail, and she wore no makeup. The golden police chief badge that she had worked 20 years to earn stayed locked in her drawer. The clock on her wall showed 6:30 a.m. Dr. Carter picked up her old leather notebook and a pen from her desk. These simple tools would help her learn more about her new department than any official report could tell her. As the first black female police chief in the city's history, she knew she needed to see the real picture, not just what people wanted to show her. The drive to the Central Precinct area took longer than usual. Morning traffic moved slowly, but Dr. Carter didn't mind. She used this time to think about her plan. After 20 years on the force in another city, she knew that real change had to start with understanding. And to understand, she needed to see how officers behaved when they didn't know their boss was watching. At 7:15 a.m., she parked her old Honda Civic a block away from Joey's Cafe, a popular spot where many police officers stopped for their morning coffee. The cafe sat across from the Central Precinct, its large windows offering a clear view of the station's entrance. Dr. Carter had done her homework. She knew this was where she would see officers being themselves. The bell above the cafe door rang softly as she walked in. The smell of fresh coffee and warm bread filled the air. A young barista with bright blue hair smiled at her from behind the counter. "Good morning. What can I get for you?" "Just a regular coffee, please." "Black," Dr. Carter replied, keeping her voice casual. She chose a small table in the corner, one with a good view of both the cafe entrance and the precinct across the street. The wooden chair creaked slightly as she sat down. Opening her notebook, Dr. Carter began writing down her first observations. 3 police cars had parked outside the precinct since she arrived. 6 officers had walked into the building, 4 of them carrying coffee cups from different shops. The morning shift change was happening, and soon more officers would come in for their coffee break. The barista brought her coffee over, the steam rising in lazy swirls above the cup. "Here you go, ma'am. Let me know if you need anything else." Dr. Carter thanked her with a smile and took a small sip. The coffee was good, strong and hot, just the way she liked it. As she watched, more people began filling the cafe. Business workers in suits grabbed quick breakfasts. Students with backpacks ordered complicated drinks with extra shots of espresso. And just as she expected, police officers started coming in. They moved in pairs or small groups, their blue uniforms standing out against the morning crowd. Dr. Carter noticed things that others might miss. She saw how some officers treated the barista with respect, while others barely looked at her. She watched their body language as they interacted with different customers. In her notebook, she wrote down times, badge numbers she could see, and brief descriptions of their behavior. One group of officers caught her attention more than the others. They stood near the counter, talking loudly about their last shift. Their stories were filled with jokes about the people they had arrested, and they didn't seem to care who heard them. Dr. Carter's pen moved quickly across the paper, recording their words. The morning grew busier, and the cafe filled with more noise. Dr. Carter stayed focused on her task, taking careful notes while appearing to be just another customer enjoying her coffee. Her years of experience had taught her patience. She knew that real understanding took time, and she was prepared to spend as long as needed to learn the truth about her new department. Little did she know that her quiet morning of observation was about to turn into something much more serious. As she wrote another note in her book, the cafe door opened again. 2 more officers walked in, and the atmosphere in the room began to change. The next few minutes would test everything she believed about her new role and the department she had come to lead. Officers Mike Reynolds and James Sullivan pushed through the cafe door at exactly 8:45 a.m. Their heavy boots made loud sounds against the wooden floor as they walked in. Officer Reynolds, the taller of the two, had been on the force for 15 years. His partner, Sullivan, had 12 years of service under his belt. Both men carried themselves with the confidence that came from years of having authority. The morning rush had slowed down, and only a few customers remained in the cafe. Dr. Carter sat quietly in her corner, her pen moving across the paper as she wrote down her observations. She noticed how the 2 officers scanned the room, their eyes moving from person to person until they landed on her. Officer Reynolds nudged his partner's arm and whispered something. Sullivan's face changed as he looked at Dr. Carter again. She kept writing in her notebook, pretending not to notice their stares. The blue-haired barista behind the counter seemed to sense the tension. Her cheerful "Good morning, officers," met with only grunt responses. "What can I get for you today?" the barista asked, trying to keep her voice bright. Reynolds ordered 2 large coffees without looking at her, his eyes still fixed on Dr. Carter's table. As they waited for their drinks, both officers moved to stand where they could watch her more closely. Dr. Carter felt their eyes on her but stayed calm. She had dealt with suspicious officers before, though she had hoped things would be different in her new department. She took another sip of her coffee and wrote down the time and the officers' badge numbers, which she could see clearly from where she sat. The barista called out their order, but instead of taking their coffees to a table, the officers started walking toward Dr. Carter. Officer Reynolds led the way, his coffee held carelessly in his right hand. As he got closer, his walk became more aggressive, his shoulders squared as if preparing for confrontation. "Awful lot of notes you're taking there," Reynolds said, his voice loud enough for everyone in the cafe to hear. Dr. Carter looked up calmly, her face neutral. Before she could speak, Reynolds took another step forward, pretending to trip. His movement wasn't natural. Anyone watching could see it was on purpose. His coffee cup tilted forward, spilling hot liquid across Dr. Carter's notebook. Some of it splashed onto her white t-shirt, but she didn't flinch. The few remaining customers in the cafe grew quiet, all eyes now on their corner. "Oh, my mistake," Reynolds said, his voice dripping with fake concern. "Guess I should watch where I'm going." Behind him, Officer Sullivan smirked, crossing his arms across his chest. Dr. Carter carefully closed her wet notebook and looked directly at Officer Reynolds. "Could I have your badge number, please?" she asked quietly. Her calm request seemed to anger Reynolds even more. "Listen here," he growled, leaning down close to her table. "We've been watching you take notes on us all morning. What's your business here?" His coffee cup was still half full, and he held it dangerously close to the edge of her table. The blue-haired barista had moved closer, holding a stack of napkins, but she stopped when Sullivan gave her a warning look. Other customers had pulled out their phones, some openly recording the scene, others pretending to text while watching everything unfold. "I asked for your badge number, officer," Dr. Carter repeated, her voice still steady. She reached slowly for her bag, but Reynolds moved faster. This time there was no pretense of an accident. He knocked his coffee cup directly into her lap, the hot liquid soaking through her jeans. "Now look what you made me do," Reynolds said loudly. "If you hadn't been making suspicious movements, this wouldn't have happened." Sullivan stepped closer, his hand resting on his belt near his radio, trying to look intimidating. The cafe had fallen completely silent. The only sound was the quiet drip of coffee from the edge of the table onto the floor. Dr. Carter stood up slowly, coffee staining her clothes, her expression unchanged. She reached into her bag again, and this time, neither officer tried to stop her. The moment that would change everything in the central precinct was about to happen. Dr. Carter's hand emerged from her bag, holding something that would wipe the smug looks off both officers' faces in an instant. Time seemed to freeze in Joey's cafe as Dr. Carter's hand moved toward her bag. The coffee stains on her white shirt and blue jeans were spreading, but her face showed no sign of pain or fear. Officer Reynolds stood over her, his empty coffee cup still held like a weapon, while Officer Sullivan watched with his hand near his radio. "I wouldn't do that if I were you," Sullivan warned, his voice sharp in the quiet cafe. "Keep your hands where we can see them." The few customers who remained had pressed themselves against the walls, their phones recording every moment. The blue-haired barista stood frozen behind the counter, still clutching the unused napkins. Dr. Carter paused, her hand just above her bag. "Officers," she said calmly, her voice carrying across the silent room, "I'm going to reach into my bag very slowly. I suggest you both pay close attention to what I'm about to show you." The confidence in her voice made Reynolds take a small step back. "Last warning," Reynolds growled, but his voice had lost some of its earlier power. Something about Dr. Carter's calm behavior was making him nervous. People who had done nothing wrong usually showed fear by now, but this woman seemed completely unafraid. Dr. Carter's hand moved again, slowly pulling out a small leather wallet. Both officers tensed up, their faces showing a mix of anger and uncertainty. The wallet looked official, too official for their comfort. The blue-haired barista had edged closer again, sensing that something important was about to happen. "Before I open this," Dr. Carter said, holding the wallet at chest level, "I want to confirm your badge numbers. Officer Reynolds, your number 8457, and Officer Sullivan, your 8913. Is that correct?" Both officers' faces showed surprise as she read their numbers perfectly. Reynolds tried to regain control of the situation. "Put the wallet down and step away from the table," he ordered, but his voice cracked slightly. The coffee he had spilled was now dripping steadily onto the floor, creating a small puddle around Dr. Carter's feet. "I don't think I'll be doing that," Dr. Carter replied. She opened the wallet with deliberate slowness. "You see, officers, you've made a series of very poor decisions this morning. But throwing hot coffee on the new police chief?" She paused as she held up her badge and ID. "That might be the worst decision of your careers." The color drained from both officers' faces so quickly that the barista later swore she could actually see it happen. Reynolds' empty coffee cup slipped from his fingers, clattering on the floor. Sullivan's hand dropped away from his radio as if it had suddenly become red hot. "Chief Carter?" Reynolds stammered, his voice barely a whisper. The cafe erupted in shocked murmurs. Several customers who had been recording quickly shared their videos, their fingers moving rapidly over their phone screens. "That's correct, Officer Reynolds," Dr. Carter said, standing up straight despite her coffee-soaked clothes. "And we're going to have a very interesting conversation about what just happened here. But first," she turned to look at the stunned customers and the wide-eyed barista. "Would anyone who recorded this incident please make sure to save those videos? The department will need them for our internal investigation." Sullivan found his voice first. "Chief, we didn't. We thought you were acting suspicious." His words trailed off as Dr. Carter raised her hand to stop him. "Acting suspicious?" she repeated, her voice taking on an edge of steel. "Let me tell you what I observed this morning. I watched officers from my department harass and assault a civilian who was doing nothing more than sitting quietly in a public space. The fact that this civilian turned out to be your new chief is actually the least troubling part of this situation." The morning sun now streamed fully through the cafe windows, illuminating the scene like a spotlight on a stage. Dr. Carter's coffee-stained clothes stood in sharp contrast to the officers' crisp uniforms. But there was no doubt about who held the real authority in the room. The next few minutes would determine not just these officers' futures, but the future of the entire police department. And Dr. Samantha Carter was just getting started. The news spread through the central precinct like wildfire. Officers who had been starting their morning paperwork suddenly found their phones buzzing with messages and video clips from Joey's Cafe. The videos showed their colleagues, Reynolds and Sullivan, throwing coffee at a woman in civilian clothes, a woman who turned out to be their new boss. Back in the cafe, Dr. Carter took control of the situation with quiet authority. She pulled out her phone and dialed a number she had memorized just days before. "This is Chief Carter," she said into the phone, her voice clear and professional despite her stained clothes. "I need internal affairs at Joey's Cafe across from Central Precinct, immediately." Officers Reynolds and Sullivan stood rooted to their spots, their faces pale and sweaty. The tough, intimidating manner they had shown earlier had vanished completely. Sullivan kept opening and closing his mouth like a fish out of water, while Reynolds stared at his own shoes as if they held the answers to his problems. The blue-haired barista, whose name tag reads Sarah, finally found her courage. She walked over to Dr. Carter with a handful of clean towels and a fresh cup of coffee. "Here, Chief," she said softly. "I'm so sorry this happened. I should have done something sooner." Dr. Carter took the towels with a gentle smile. "Thank you, Sarah, but this isn't your fault. In fact, you're going to be an important witness." She turned back to the two officers. "Both of you, sit down. Right there." She pointed to a nearby table. "Don't move, don't speak to each other, and don't touch your phones." The cafe door opened, and more officers began arriving. These were senior officers who had been at the morning briefing when their phones lit up with the viral videos. They stopped short at the scene before them, their new chief in coffee-stained clothes, two of their colleagues sitting in shame, and half a dozen civilians with phones still recording everything. Captain James Chen, a 25-year veteran of the force, pushed through the crowd. "Chief Carter," he said, his face showing both respect and embarrassment. We, he struggled to find the right words. Captain Chen, Dr. Carter acknowledged him. I trust you've seen the videos? When he nodded, she continued. Good, then you understand why Internal Affairs is on their way. I want statements from everyone in this cafe, and I want the security footage secured. The other customers in the cafe began sharing their recordings with Captain Chen. Sarah, the barista, brought out the cafe's security camera footage on a USB drive. I made a copy right away, she explained. I knew it would be important. Through it all, Dr. Carter remained standing, ignoring the discomfort of her wet clothes. She watched as Internal Affairs officers arrived, their faces serious as they took in the scene. The two officers who had seemed so powerful just minutes ago now looked small and afraid as they were separated for questioning. One of the Internal Affairs officers, Lieutenant Maria Rodriguez, approached Dr. Carter with a look of concern. Chief, would you like to change clothes before giving your statement? We can send someone to get you a fresh uniform. Dr. Carter shook her head. No, Lieutenant. I want to stay exactly as I am. These clothes are evidence of what happens when officers abuse their power. This isn't just about me. It's about every person who has ever faced harassment from those sworn to protect them. The morning sun now filled the cafe completely, highlighting the coffee stains on Dr. Carter's clothes like a badge of honor. Outside, news vans were beginning to arrive, their reporters drawn by the viral videos and rumors of a police chief being assaulted by her own officers. This was not how Dr. Carter had planned to introduce herself to her department or the city. But as she looked around the cafe, at the supportive faces of the civilians, the determined expressions of the Internal Affairs officers, and the mix of shame and shock on her other officers' faces, she knew that sometimes the best lessons came from unexpected moments. The real work of changing the department's culture was about to begin, and it would start right here in Joey's Cafe. By noon, the incident at Joey's Cafe had become the biggest story in the city. News helicopters circled overhead, their cameras focused on the small coffee shop that had suddenly become the center of attention. Inside her temporary office at Central Precinct, Dr. Carter watched the scene unfold on multiple TV screens, still wearing her coffee-stained clothes. The department's public relations team buzzed around her like nervous bees, suggesting statements and damage control strategies. But Dr. Carter had other plans. She turned off the TV screens and faced the room full of senior officers who had gathered for an emergency meeting. Gentlemen, ladies, she began, her voice steady and clear. What happened this morning was not a PR crisis. It was a revelation. She pulled out her notebook, somehow still readable despite the coffee stains. In just 3 hours of observation, I witnessed 6 separate incidents of officers showing disrespect to civilians. And that was before Officers Reynolds and Sullivan decided to escalate things. Captain Chen shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Chief, about Reynolds and Sullivan, they both expressed deep regret. They're requesting to apologize personally. His voice trailed off as Dr. Carter raised her hand. They'll have their chance, she said firmly. But right now, we need to address the bigger issue. Those officers felt comfortable enough to harass and assault someone in broad daylight, in front of witnesses. That tells me everything I need to know about the culture in this department. The room fell silent. Outside, they could hear the distant sound of protesters gathering. Word had spread quickly through social media, and people were arriving with signs demanding police accountability. The viral videos of the incident had already been viewed millions of times. Sarah, the blue-haired barista, had become an unexpected hero on social media. Her quick thinking in saving the security footage and standing up for Dr. Carter had earned her praise from civil rights activists. Local news stations were running interviews with cafe customers who had witnessed the incident. Back in the meeting room, Dr. Carter pulled out a fresh notebook. Starting today, we're making changes. Big ones. She began writing on the whiteboard, her movements sharp and determined. First, every officer will undergo new training on civilian interaction. No exceptions. One of the older surgeons cleared his throat. Chief, with all due respect, we already have training programs. Clearly, they're not working, Dr. Carter cut him off. Tell me, Sergeant Brooks, how many civilian complaints has your precinct received in the last year? When he couldn't answer, she continued, 37. I reviewed them all last night. That stops now. The phone on the conference table rang. It was the mayor's office, the third call in the last hour. Dr. Carter let it go to voicemail. She had more important things to handle than political damage control. Internal Affairs will complete their investigation by the end of the week, she announced. But we're not waiting for their report to start making changes. Every officer in this department will wear body cameras starting tomorrow. No exceptions, no excuses. Through the window, they could see more news vans arriving. The crowd of protesters had grown larger, their chants now clearly audible inside the building. But unlike previous protests, this one had a different tone. Mixed in with the angry voices were calls of support for the new chief. Dr. Carter walked to the window, her coffee-stained reflection visible in the glass. "I came here to make changes," she said, more quietly now. "I just didn't expect to start like this. But maybe this is exactly what we needed. A clear example of why change is necessary." She turned back to face her command staff. Officers Reynolds and Sullivan will face consequences for their actions, but they're not the only ones who need to change. Every person in this department needs to understand that the old ways of doing things are over. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the conference room as Dr. Carter outlined her plans for departmental reform. Outside, the crowds continued to grow, and social media buzzed with discussions about police accountability. In just a few hours, a simple cup of coffee had become a catalyst for change that would affect the entire city. 1 week after the coffee incident, Dr. Carter stood in front of 300 police officers in the department's main training room. The coffee-stained clothes she had worn that day hung in a frame on the wall behind her, a powerful reminder of why they were all there. Every seat was filled, and the tension in the room was thick enough to cut with a knife. "Look at those clothes," Dr. Carter began, pointing to the frame. "Some of you might think I'm displaying them to shame Officers Reynolds and Sullivan. You're wrong." She paused, letting her words sink in. "Those clothes remind us that change isn't always comfortable. Sometimes it burns, like hot coffee on your skin." In the front row, Captain Chen watched as officers shifted uneasily in their seats. The past week had been difficult for everyone. Internal Affairs had interviewed over 50 officers, uncovering patterns of behavior that went far beyond the coffee shop incident. The local news ran stories every night about police conduct, using footage from Joey's Cafe as their lead-in. "Today, we start our new training program," Dr. Carter continued, picking up a thick manual from her podium. "But before we open these books, I want you to hear some stories. Sarah, would you please come in?" The blue-haired barista from Joey's Cafe walked into the room, her hands slightly shaking but her head held high. Some officers looked away, unable to meet her eyes. Others watched with interest as she took her place next to Dr. Carter. "Tell them what you saw that morning," Dr. Carter encouraged. "Not just what happened to me. Tell them about everything you've witnessed over the past year." Sarah's voice started soft but grew stronger as she spoke. She told them about officers who bullied customers, who made racist comments, who acted like they owned the place instead of serving it. She described how some people would leave the cafe as soon as certain officers walked in, too afraid to stay. When Sarah finished speaking, Dr. Carter thanked her and turned back to her officers. "That's how the community sees us. Not as protectors, but as threats. And until last week, most of you thought that was okay." She clicked a button, and the video from the cafe played on the large screen behind her. Officers Reynolds and Sullivan weren't present. They were on administrative leave pending the investigation's outcome. But their actions played out on the screen for everyone to see, from multiple angles captured by phone cameras and security footage. Dr. Carter let the videos play without comment, letting the images speak for themselves. "Now," she said after the videos ended, "let's talk about what should have happened that morning." She began breaking down the incident, pointing out every moment where different choices could have been made. The training manual she had prepared included real examples from the department's history, showing both good and bad decisions. Some of the older officers grumbled quietly, resistant to change. But others, especially the younger ones, took notes and asked questions. They could see that the world was changing, and they needed to change with it. Dr. Carter answered every question honestly, even the hostile ones. "I know some of you think this training is punishment," she said near the end of the session. "It's not. It's an opportunity. We can be better than what those videos show. We must be better, because the community deserves better." As the officers filed out for their lunch break, Dr. Carter noticed small groups forming in the hallway. They weren't just talking about sports or weekend plans. They were discussing what they'd learned. Some were sharing their own stories of times they could have handled situations differently. Sarah stayed behind, watching the officers leave. "Do you think it will make a difference?" she asked Dr. Carter quietly. Dr. Carter looked at her coffee-stained clothes in the frame, then back at the training room where 300 officers had just taken their first step toward real change. "It already has," she replied. "Change starts with acknowledgement, and today, for the first time, they're acknowledging that we need to change." 1 month after the coffee incident, Joey's Cafe looked very different. The small coffee shop had become a symbol of change in the city. Community leaders had painted a new mural on the outside wall, showing hands of different colors joined together. Inside, the table where Dr. Carter had sat was marked with a small plaque that read, "Reserved for Community Dialogue." On this particular evening, the cafe stayed open late. Every table was full, but not with the usual coffee drinkers. Community members sat side by side with police officers, sharing stories and concerns in small groups. Dr. Carter moved between the tables, listening more than she spoke. Marcus Johnson, a local pastor, stood up to address the crowd. "A month ago, I wouldn't have believed this was possible," he said, gesturing to the mixed groups around him. "For years, we tried to tell the police department about our experiences, but it took a cup of coffee to make them finally listen." Sarah, still working as a barista but now seen as a community hero, served free coffee to everyone. She had become an important bridge between the police and the community. Officers who had once ignored her now knew her by name, and she helped keep the conversations honest and real. In one corner, Officer Reynolds sat with a group of young black teenagers. After his suspension and retraining, he had asked to be part of the community outreach program. The teenagers were skeptical at first, but as Reynolds shared his story of learning and change, they began to open up about their own experiences with police. "I used to think authority meant making people fear you," Reynolds admitted to the group, his face showing shame at his past actions. "But Chief Carter showed me that real authority comes from respect, and respect has to be earned." The teenagers nodded, some sharing their own stories of times they had felt afraid of the police. At another table, community activists who had once protested against the police department now sat with senior officers, working together on new policies. They discussed ideas for better training, community involvement, and ways to hold officers accountable for their actions. Dr. Carter watched as an elderly woman shared a painful story about her grandson's encounter with police last year. Instead of becoming defensive, the officers at her table listened with genuine concern. They asked questions about how they could have handled the situation better, taking notes for their next training session. Outside the cafe, news crews set up their cameras. The story of how a cup of coffee changed a police department had spread across the country. Other cities were calling Dr. Carter, asking how they could create similar programs. But she always told them the same thing: start by listening to your community. Real change begins with honest conversations. Sullivan, who had also gone through retraining, now worked with Sarah to organize these community meetings. The officer who had once smirked at civilian complaints now spent his free time teaching other officers how to better interact with the public. His transformation had surprised everyone, including himself. As the evening went on, more people arrived. Some came to share angry stories about past encounters with police. Others came with hope for better relationships in the future. Dr. Carter made sure every voice was heard, every story acknowledged. The city's mayor stopped by briefly, hoping to get some positive publicity. But Dr. Carter quietly reminded him that these meetings weren't about politics, they were about healing and change. He left after a few minutes, but the real work continued. Near closing time, a young girl raised her hand to speak. She couldn't have been more than 12 years old. The room fell silent as she stood up, holding her mother's hand for courage. "Last year, I was afraid every time I saw a police car in my neighborhood," she said in a clear voice. "But now, I know some of the officers by name. They come to our community center. They listen to us. They're trying to be better." She looked directly at Dr. Carter. "That cup of coffee didn't just burn you, Chief Carter. It woke up our whole city." The room burst into applause, and even some of the toughest officers wiped tears from their eyes. Dr. Carter smiled, knowing that real change was finally happening, one conversation at a time. 1 year had passed since the coffee incident at Joey's Cafe. Dr. Carter stood at her office window, looking down at the street where officers and civilians walked together, talking and laughing. The department had changed so much that sometimes it felt like a different place entirely. The morning's newspaper lay on her desk, showing a front-page story about the department's transformation. The headline read, "1 year later, how a cup of coffee changed our city's police force." Next to the article was a split photo. On one side, the infamous coffee-stained clothes, and on the other, a picture of last week's community celebration at the cafe. A knock on her door interrupted her thoughts. Officers Reynolds and Sullivan entered, followed by Sarah, the blue-haired barista who had become the department's official community liaison. They were there for their monthly progress meeting, but today felt special. "Can you believe it's been a year?" Sarah asked, settling into one of the office chairs. She now wore a badge of her own, not a police badge, but one that identified her as the head of the new Community Advisory Board. Reynolds looked different from the angry officer who had thrown coffee a year ago. His face was softer, his uniform worn with humility instead of arrogance. "Chief," he said, placing a folder on her desk, "I wanted you to see this first. Our community complaints are down 87% from last year." Sullivan nodded, adding his own report. "And community participation in our programs is up 300%. The youth center we opened last month is already full every afternoon." His voice carried pride, but not the kind of pride that had once made him intimidate civilians. This was pride in serving his community. Dr. Carter opened the folders, reviewing the numbers. Every page told the story of real change. Officers were spending more time helping people and less time confronting them. The emergency response times had improved, and community trust scores had reached their highest levels ever. "There's something else," Sarah said, pulling out her phone. She showed them a social media post from that morning. It showed a young officer helping an elderly woman with her groceries. The post had thousands of likes and comments, with people sharing their own positive experiences with the police. "That's Officer Chen's daughter," Sullivan explained. "She joined the force 3 months ago. She's part of our new generation, officers who never knew the old way of doing things." The pride in his voice was clear. He had helped train her himself. Reynolds stood up and walked to the wall where Dr. Carter's coffee-stained clothes still hung in their frame. "You know, Chief, when you first kept these here, I thought it was to shame us." He touched the frame gently. "But now I understand. It's not about shame. It's about remembering that change is possible." Dr. Carter smiled, remembering that morning a year ago. "Change is not just possible," she said. "It's necessary. And sometimes it takes a cup of hot coffee to wake us up to that fact." Sarah's phone buzzed with a reminder. "The afternoon community meeting starts in 30 minutes, she announced. "Today's topic is expanding the youth program to more neighborhoods." They all stood, preparing to head to Joey's Cafe where the meetings were still held. The cafe had become more than just a coffee shop. It was now a symbol of transformation, a place where barriers between police and community came down over cups of coffee and honest conversation. As they walked through the department, officers and civilian staff greeted them warmly. The old tension was gone, replaced by a sense of shared purpose. Even the most resistant officers had eventually seen the benefits of the new approach. Outside, the city felt different too. People didn't cross the street anymore when they saw a police officer coming. Instead, they'd often stop to chat, sharing concerns, or just saying hello. The fear had been replaced by trust, built one interaction at a time. Dr. Carter looked at her reflection in the cafe window as they approached. She saw not just her own face, but the faces of everyone who had been part of this change: officers, community members, and countless others who had believed that things could be better. Inside Joey's Cafe, at the table where it all began, a new generation of officers and citizens waited to continue the work of building a better department, a better community, and a better future. The coffee stains had long since faded, but the lessons they taught would last forever.